Okay, I think maybe I'm live. Somebody want to give a shout out, whether you can hear me or not?
Hi, we can hear you.
Hi, okay, good. So, welcome to B75. Yet again, coming to you from your laptop. And what we're, just to set the table here a little bit, what we're moving into is you have an essay in the discussion section on melodrama that's 25 pages, single type, so it's fairly long. And we'll stick with that for the next 4 classes on melodrama. We'll be working through that. So if you haven't read all of it, you've just got time. If you've read it quickly, you'll be able to go back. Then you have or will view Broken Blossoms, directed by D.W. Griffith, 1919. And there is a prompt in the discussion section. I think 15 or so of you got to it, which I appreciate. The more that can get to it before Monday night, the more I have to work with. I hit reply on several and wrote back little bits. Typically my replies try and do a couple of things, highlight what I see as your more important insights, maybe draw attention to something that you mentioned in passing that actually seems more central to me than it appears in your prompt. I'll also bring in like, yes, this is true, and it's also relevant in this other movie, and as that kind of comment will occur more as the class goes forward. We're doing 3 genres: melodrama, film noir, the Western, as the other B76 does, romance, horror, and science fiction. And but all genres, all 6 of these genres, have a common denominator, and that is that they are narrative formulations that generate affect in relationship to the felt experience of modernity in all of its manifestations. They tend to prioritize different hopes, fears, dreams, desires. So film noir is probably the least hopeful of the genres, but it's also the most yearning of them all. Melodrama is, as we've already gathered from the discussion prompt, seems very concerned with what else other than the secular is of value, particularly in the context of modernity, where the value system has become so constricted that the way to generate value, there is a way to generate value in the culture, but it's tied in with the market, it's tied in with accumulation, and sort of cause and effect and present time, and has no real ability to ask the larger question of how did we get here? Why, why are we living? Does it matter? If it matters, why? When we come to the end of our life, what will it have signified? Because that's the one area where the secular breaks away very sharply. Like most of the metrics we have for measuring value in the secular life have no transcendence, to use that word. They don't survive your passing. We hear that about money all the time, that you can't take it with you. But not only is there the issue of what's the point of all these things that you have at the end of your life if you can't take them with you, but also is when you leave, what, if anything, have you left behind? Because that's another area where the value system is extremely constricted. We all know about inheritance. So you can leave behind an estate, you can leave behind a lot of money, heirs can come into that. But that's extremely narrow. It's not that there's anything wrong. And I want to make this point because it'll sound like I'm I'll be criticizing it all the time, but the way in which the secular capitalist system generates value, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with it. The problem is its singularity, that it eclipses and forecloses any other value system. So it creates this enormous anxiety or exhilaration. I mean, the advantage of having such a narrow definition of value and success is that when you feel like you're in the groove, so to speak, you get all the exhilaration, and then when you feel like you're thrown out of it and not a success, or that popular word these days, loser versus winner, you're devastated, depressed, anxious, and desperate to get back into that groove. And that's where, in this specifically in Broken Blossoms, opium becomes such an interesting chemically induced transcendence. I mean, there's a reason that there's so much emphasis on drugs in our culture, whether they're prescription, and I'm not anti-drug, anti-prescription drug. I think they can do really useful things, including antidepressants and the rest of that. But the reality is, and we went through this thing with OxyContin, that there's a kind of hidden price to chemically generating a sense of well-being. It's not tethered to anything other than the taking of the drug. So when the effect of the drug wears off, because nothing happened to produce the feeling other than the chemical reaction with the drug, there's no, it's such a narrow return, like, well, I have to go back to that. We'll see in melodrama that sustainable exhilaration, if we want to call it that, is very subtle. It can't compete with drugs in a way. And the history of drugs in the 20th century has also been the history of intensifying the drugs. So you go from morphine to heroin, you go from cocaine to crack to methamphetamine. At each step, you double, triple, quadruple the release of the chemically induced euphoria, which makes it both more seductive, for want of a better word, and more destructive, more difficult to turn away from. So that's by way of introduction. But the purpose of this, what I call open class, is I'll talk a bit, as I'm doing now, but it's also intended to generate you guys into asking questions, making comments, inviting me to interact with the beginnings of your own insights. And one thing I do from time to time, and I think we will do one tonight to get the ball rolling, is do brief free writes, where I'm going to give you a short question and you'll work on it for 2 minutes, wherever you are. I don't even know if you're in Toronto. And then we'll go through it together, and you can read some of it, or you can paraphrase what you wrote. And the spirit of the free write is this: you can't get it wrong, and it's not graded. You're not turning it in. It's really you coming into immediate contact with your initial thoughts on usually on some kind of moral or philosophical dilemma. I'm holding back on telling you the free write question until we're ready to do it, because I actually don't want you to pre-think it a lot. I want you to write down anything, including your confusion, so that if you're like, well, I don't know, typically my free writes are, what's the difference between A and B? And you may well say, they're the same, or I don't know, and that's okay. And then we can build on that, because the binaries, meaning is generated by the tension between binaries. So the word cold, it cannot fully have any meaning if we don't also understand the word hot. And hot can't have any real meaning unless we understand the word cold. So the meaning of hot is not contained in the word hot. It's contained in the tension between the word hot and the word cold. So language works by the juxtaposition of binaries. And the meaning that words are able to generate is actually the result of the friction, if you will. There's different words we could use, or the conflict or the collision even between two binaries. And the reason I draw your attention to this is that is the basic language of cinema. Cinema trades in images. Now, 1919 is still the silent era. There was almost 25, 30 years of cinema before sound was technically possible. Many of those movies are lost. Many of them are not, viewed anymore. There's a general sense of, well, they couldn't have been as interesting back then. I think they were, and you can let me know what you think with something like Broken Blossoms. They were certainly different because for the first 25 years of cinema, it had to try and figure out how to generate meaning through the juxtaposition of images. There are title cards, and Griffith uses them relatively sparingly. And in many ways, the best silent movies have the least title cards. So there was a kind of a cinema 101 right at the outset, which is show it, don't tell it. And that was technologically imposed, so that sound, when it came into being, wasn't across the board a great boon to cinema, because it made it easier to tell a story without relying on the images, and that diluted the art form. Since what cinema has that, say, a novel doesn't, is images, and the art of cinema has to figure out how to maximize the qualities of its own medium, just as sculpture would need to. I mean, you can do things in sculpture working with stone that you can't do in a novel either, and you can do things in a novel that you can't do carving stone. So often the genius of art is very closely connected to how brilliantly can you use the medium itself to convey and not manipulate that medium into simply stating something. It's very, very easy to get preachy or fail to resonate. Is something. Two words I'll be using a lot in melodrama, particularly, is what's sustainable, what resonates. Things happen all the time, but what's the difference between something that happens in a way that's sustainable and something that happens in a way that resonates versus something that happens and extinguishes itself in the act of happening? And the secular world is almost 100% of things that extinguish themselves in the act of happening. And this is the other feature. This is where transcendence is not of the secular, or to put it another way, if there is a transcendent beyond the everyday, we know it only through the way that it transmutes the everyday. So this gets a bit toward what we might consider sacred. Is I made this point, and as one of your guys' prompts caused me to talk about this, that what's interesting about any object is that it's, even if you have a sacred object, and I usually pull examples from the Christian faith because that's the one I know the best, but we're talking about religion with a capital R, so you may have examples from faiths that you know, and they're no doubt legitimate, and maybe we can even share that from time to time. But one of the most sacred objects in the Christian/Catholic faith is the chalice or the cup, and this partly goes back to the whole Mass is predicated on the what was thought to be the Last Supper of Jesus the night before he was crucified, where he had a chalice. It was probably a wooden goblet, and he said, when you drink from this cup, you drink of me and you remember me. And then he passed bread around and said, when you eat this bread, you eat of me and you remember me. So he sort of gave himself up to his disciples through the ritual of the chalice. So the entire Mass, the Catholic Mass, and it'd be interesting to hear whether there's a similar features in religious rituals that you may know, but the entire Mass is sort of completely anchored by the chalice. So it all, the priest, there's this, they read from the Bible, they comment on what the Bible has to say. There's various ceremonies, but it all keeps leading up to the priest pouring wine into a chalice, and then moving into what's called communion, where the rest of the congregation comes up, and there's usually thin paper wafers that are, no, well, they're not paper, literally, I think they're rice, which is meant to be the equivalent of the bread that Christ passed out. So everywhere in this ritual, what's interesting is what is the most important moment in the Catholic Mass is the moment when the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ. Now, in fact, there were wars fought over this, because during the Reformation, when the Catholic Church splintered, there were those who said that's metaphor, that at no point in an actual Mass does that happen. It was called transubstantiation. But other factions of the faith said, no, it actually happens. A miracle happens in every Mass. And this became a point of fierce contention. But the point is that the religious ritual is always trying to be the interface between the sacred and the secular. So you come into the church from your everyday life, and then something happens beyond the everyday. And the very architecture of churches, in temples, I would imagine, and mosques, certainly, speak to this. The architecture itself immediately tries to draw attention away from the everyday. So churches, temples, mosques, they're typically quiet. The lighting is subdued. Catholic churches have stained glass windows. Perhaps other structures do too. So you have filtered light. It's dimmer. It's obviously more quiet. And in various ways, the architecture is domed. So you can have the flying buttresses of Notre Dame. The mosque obviously has a very tall dome. Catholic churches have spires, steeples. Everything is pointing up. The whole effect of much of the architecture of religious buildings is to literally move the eye up, and thereby also move thoughts upward. Many religions utilize incense, primarily because of the optic of smoke moving up. I mean, the incense is scented, but that's less important than watching the smoke rise. And this goes all the way back to, sacrifices recounted in the Bible of offering a lamb and burning the lamb, and the smoke goes up to the sky. So this is a very, and that's an interesting example of taking an ordinary lamb and sacrificing it. And in doing that, making that ordinary lamb extraordinary. So what makes the ordinary extraordinary? And melodrama makes it clear that it's easy to fake the transmutation of the ordinary into the extraordinary. The most obvious way is, things like opium, and you'll notice that Cheng Huan, part of the tension of Broken Blossoms is, when does he perceive the sacredness, if you will, of Lucy's innocence directly, versus, he has to, in a sense, he has to stop smoking opium, although it's not, the big point is not made of it, but there's just this sort of subtle implication that he's the more he has Lucy, the less he needs opium. And yet there's that crucial moment where he comes back to the house, and the title card even says, a perfumed whiff of opium still in his brain. And Lucy has, having been badly beaten by battling burros, is collapsed on his hearth. And the way it's filmed, clearly he assumes it's a hallucination. I mean, he's already seen Lucy. He's watched her. She walks by his shop, and he just assumes that she's an opium dream. But as the opium fades away, Lucy is still there. And that's, in some ways, I think that's the crucial turning point for for Cheng Huan. There's roughly two turning points. We see Cheng Huan in an idealistic state in China, in the temple. And then in the only serious time jump of Broken Blossoms, because it really the events after Cheng Huan is suddenly shown to be in London. Those events are maybe a month, maybe 3 weeks, and there's no real break. But there is this jump. We go right from the temple scene to, and all of a sudden it's like, here he is. It's years later. He's partly running an opium den, perhaps or certainly he's participating in it. And we just get one title card about how all his dreams had run up against reality. So that was the first transition where he is forced away from his contemplation of what's above and beyond life. And Lucy obviously turns his attention back to the meditative, to the contemplative, with certain crisis points. There is a very very effective parallel scene between battling burros in a boxing match and Cheng Huan, the way it's filmed with extreme close-up, and the fear on Lucy's face. He seems to be coming toward her with much more, all of a sudden, of a sexual intent, sort of like, what can you do for me, or how can I use you, which Burroughs does all the time. And then at the last minute, his face sort of moves aside, and he kisses the hem of her dress, and then the title card comes up and says, he remains pure, and a very strange title card, because it says even his worst foe says so, and that's just completely not true. Absolutely everybody in the movie assumes, all the men, all of Burroughs' friends, Burroughs himself, they think, they're racist, and they assume that he's either pimping Lucy out or keeping her for himself. It doesn't even occur to them for a minute that he might be trying to care for her. So the title card doesn't make any sense. Not only does and everybody that we see in the movie thinks the worst of Cheng Huan. Okay, so let me pause there after that preamble and invite you guys to, partly I was giving more participants time to come in. We can take a pause from the philosophical for the moment too. Is how do you have any questions so far about the administration of the class? Anything you're concerned about about the quality of how you're connecting to this, because this video stuff is it's doable, but it's tricky. And let me see if I have a list of the class for a moment. I should pick on somebody maybe that might have had me before. So Jinwoo, you had what classes have you had with me? I know you've had more than one.
This is actually my first class with you.
It is? That's funny.
Yeah.
Why was I sure I'd seen your name before? Okay. Well, now that I called on you anyway, how's the class starting up for you? Had you ever seen a silent movie before? Did you get what part of, how much of Broken Blossoms did you get through, and what did you think?
This is the first silent film that I've watched. And there was some stuff about it that I didn't really like.
Go ahead.
Like the casting.
Start with that. Like the what?
The casting.
Yeah. Oh,
I
the
thought it was
casting.
kind of weird.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that hasn't improved all that much. I mean, wasn't it just?
Yeah.
Was it Scarlett Johansson who was cast in a role that was made famous I think in Asian anime? I don't know if I've got all. I've forgotten the movie now, but it kind of bombed, and I think that was part of the reason that they simply cast white Caucasian in a role that had been generated through an Asian cultural phenomenon. So that's a very fair criticism. But what else?
But I did like all the different meanings, and the thing you mentioned about like even the axe coming through the door was reused in Shining.
Mhm.
So it's really interesting to see like movies I do recognize and have seen implementing like ideas and imagery that was used in Broken Blossoms. And even just the whole like the idea of like a sacrifice or like the purity is stuff that are still used today. That was really introduced like this is 1919,
Mhm.
so like from such a long time ago. I think that was really interesting to see, especially considering this was my first silent film.
Mhm.
Seeing that was really cool.
Yeah, and so were there? Well, the point about The Shining, I think I tried to make this point in the taped lecture, but it seems important to me, is that Kubrick, who's obviously one of the geniuses of more contemporary cinema, I think it's really telling that in a way, it's not just that he's copying this. I think what he's saying is, I don't. We haven't gone beyond Griffith in some of these things. Like he invented so many. Like he literally was the first to use a close up. His ability to understand would come well, how should I put it, to discover things a medium could do that hadn't occurred to anyone else. I mean, it's amazing when you look at early cinema that nobody other than recording image on film, nobody thought cinema could do anything one way or the other. And Griffith broke it wide open. Eisenstein did something similar in Russia, but Griffith really he'd invented narrative cinema. He created the ability to not just tell stories with images, but to generate emotion within the stories. That's where he really brought cinema into a modern art form, because other directors were learning how to tell a story, but they, other than the novelty of seeing people move around, they weren't that moving. And they liked to do the plots from well-known novels, but it was so wooden. I mean, they would just go through the motions of famous scenes, and people kind of watched it and they were sort of intrigued at the images, but they weren't drawn in to the story. And that's what Griffith discovered. So even that issue of like, okay, so let's say you're Griffith and you're like, all right, I got this scene. The dad's dragging her back. She runs into the closet, locks the door. How do I want to film this? And this is something I encourage you to think about when you're writing your prompts and when you're writing your midterm and your final. Always remember that every shot you're thinking about was a choice. It could have been the screenwriter, it could have been the director. Apparently Lillian Gish came up with the forced smile, the pushing up and then Griffith seized on it and said, that's great, we can use that. So he seemed to have an eye for how do you convey emotions, what are visual equivalents of emotion. I don't want to say Lucy's sad. Lucy never smiles because she has nothing to smile about. How do I show an emotion, which on the face of it's impossible. So and yet Griffith manages it. And so when Griffith came up with that idea of shooting the scene from the side so that the axe would cut across the screen, most directors would have done the more obvious. They would have had the door and then straight on, and then an axe would have come through the door, but that wouldn't have conveyed her terror as well. That would have been more like us thinking about, oh, I'm looking at a door. Somehow the way Griffith does it is we are watching almost through her eyes, and not just point of view shots, but the number of, because in some ways that closet scene also is sort of telegraphs Hitchcock's shower scene from Psycho. Not as specifically, but in the sense of taking a claustrophobic space. Hitchcock is also beholden to this scene. Nobody was editing with so many cuts at this time. And of course, Hitchcock famously will do like 78 cuts in 46 seconds or something. Nothing like that, but Griffith is cutting way more. And he's exploring that one way to convey anxiety is to have point of view shots shifting rapidly, and so in the combination of her turning in a circle with the doll, which is also a really effective prop, and then the axe finally coming through, it also conveys how trapped she is, that she can't go out the back of the closet, she can't go out the front, and you know, for 1919, this is all kind of extraordinary. Sonia, I see your point about it. The portrayal acting choices were creepy. Can you expand on that? Because I think there's more to say about that. What were your other thoughts?
Yeah, obviously the racism kind of jumped out at me as I was watching. And at some points I got confused as to whether it was like intentional, like racism. So like the hunched back, the long nails at points, and then even the squinting of the eyes. I don't know if that was due to the opium or due to them trying to portray a white man as an Asian man. So they chose that.
Yes.
And also, I don't know if it's an aspect of a silent film, just because there is no dialogue, then it feels creepy. So
yeah, those are all good points. And a little more context. In 1915, Griffith did what the movie he's perhaps best known for, notoriously, and that was Birth of a Nation, which was based on a short story called The Klansman. And both the short story and essentially Griffith's film celebrate the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, as you know, as white men coming to the aid of a white culture that is now threatened by a post-slavery Black culture. And that Birth of a Nation is still, you know, extremely controversial. Nobody would even show that film without a lot of context, without an introduction, without a discussion afterwards, all these years later, because it does reinforce stereotypes. And silent film is even more prone to convey stereotypes because it's always looking. That's a cheap way to convey information visually. So it's very. And if Hitler, for instance, will do this quite a bit with depictions of Jewish characters in propaganda films and in the rise of Nazism in the late 30s, skulking along, you know, also juxtaposing shots of somebody clearly Jewish skulking down the road and then cut immediately to a rat going into the sewer, and using that powerful juxtaposition to say they're the same. That this ethnicity is the vermin of German culture, and that's of course where cinema's, you know, anything that's so effective at conveying emotion can definitely be used to distort, to reinforce hateful stereotypes, and of course, in the case of the actor playing Cheng Wan, who's not Asian, part of the makeup is, well, they have to look somewhat Asian, although it's not all that successful. And then but then this is where Griffith gets, you know, complicated in a way. Like there's Evil Eye, who's an even more stereotypical Chinese, depicted as a Chinese character, and he's everything you would expect. He seems interested in somehow either becoming Lucy's pimp or we don't know what, but and then Cheng Huang gets juxtaposed to that literally, like there's bookend scenes where Evil Eye is here, Cheng Huang is here, and they actually do this exchanging of gazes, which is also a development that Griffith does a lot very well with. And Lucy's kind of oblivious in the early scene where she doesn't have enough tin foil to buy the flour. And Cheng Huang knows what Evil Eye's up to. Evil Eye knows that Cheng Huang knows. The only one who doesn't know anything is Lucy in that scene. And this is a way for, you know, Griffith almost has it both ways. He's like, well, there may be stereotypical Asian predatory behavior, but Cheng Huan's an exception. And that can be damning with faint praise in terms of stereotypes of ethnicity, that because Griffith doesn't wind up saying it's racist to think of Asian people in the manner of evil eye. He winds up saying, well, yeah, that kind of depiction might be out there, but Buddhism also comes from Asian culture. And that's one of the ideas of melodrama, in fact, is that, as to quote Dorian Gray, there's a heaven and a hell in each of us. We'll see this in American Beauty with Lester Burnham's, the Kevin Spacey character, Lester Burnham's teetering on predatory versus nurturing. How about some other general comments, maybe if this is their first silent film, or see if I see any more familiar names around here. Oh yeah, Olivia, hi, how are you doing? What do you think of silent movies, Broken Blossoms, melodrama?
So this was it wasn't my first silent film, but definitely the only other melodrama that I've seen is Written on the Wind. So very different from this.
Douglas Sirk, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. What was really interesting to me is, like, with us starting here in 1919, sort of at near the beginnings of cinema itself, and certainly the genre of melodrama, is like, I don't know, I guess while I was watching it, I was trying to put myself in the shoes of someone in 1919 sitting there in the audience and trying to figure out, like, what would have been going on at that time in society, in family life in general, etc., that would have drawn people out there, and that would have, that I would have been sitting there going, yeah, I really identify with this, or I can see how this is relevant to life. And I mean, something that I thought of was, a couple of things. One was the fear of otherness. That was something that really stood out to me. And then the second was this tension in family life. Obviously, we can see that for sure. Yeah. And both in terms of, I mean, there are the women who tell Lucy, like, don't get married. So this like shattering of the rose-colored glasses view of marriage, but then also the tension between father and daughter. So I enjoyed it, but it definitely is, there are some problematic things that we could say are problematic with it.
Yeah, like some of the ones we've discussed, but
exactly.
Are there some we haven't touched on yet too, that you thought about? I mean, clearly the depiction of the Asian, but were there others, just since we're on the topic, that where you're like, oh, this would need to be critiqued? Or
I guess speaking as a woman, I felt like the portrayal of women was very weak, needing to be saved, sort of this flower that is fragile and can't last. So I guess that was the other piece that I would say we could critique and we could explore as more of a feminist perspective on the film. Good. As well.
And let me comment briefly, because I think that's important, and it will be important going forward. In 1919, the term melodrama was more generally applied to just any cinema that had drama in it, plus music. Not obviously not a soundtrack, but they would play organ music live in the theater. And melodrama really referred to using music to try and amplify the effect of what you're seeing on screen. By the time we get to the 40s, the term women's weepies or tearjerkers had become synonymous with melodrama. But at the point of Broken Blossoms, it's not fully identified as a woman's genre, but later it will be. Certainly Douglas Sirk in the 50s with Written on the Wind and Imitation of Life, and Lever, I don't know what that was, someone else, but this super technicolor, drenched with emotion. Although Sirk was an emigre from Germany, and the reason those movies are so fascinating, he built in a critique of what the studio was also demanding that he amplify. He somehow did it both ways. I mean, he made melodrama capable of social critique, which was kind of, no one even noticed until the 80s. In a way, they were just seen as sudsy, soapy, all these words that one uses. So and the fact that this was a woman, this quickly became seen as a woman genre, and then the Western and film noir, I've increasingly seen it's masculine, is that, and you can, what's so interesting to me about seeing Broken Blossoms is the genre is not set yet. I mean, there are elements of Broken Blossoms that seem proto-film noir, even visually. Like there's a couple scenes where Lucy is going down the street that are haunting, and they're as good as shots from 1940s, 1950s noir. That use of a shot where the character disappears down a street, getting smaller and smaller to indicate impending doom or helplessness. There's a lot of noir shots, and no one would have thought of that yet. But so the depictions you get of women is a mother who, for reasons that are not indicated, just gave her baby to battling burros and left, and gave her tinfoil and a ribbon, and there's just no explanation. Then, as you point out, there are the two prostitutes who say, don't do what we do. There's the beleaguered woman with the children, and the man sort of holding forth in the background. It's not clear what he's saying, but he's not helping, and complaining. And he's like, don't do that, dear. And then there's Lucy herself, who's from a modern perspective, from my perspective, just disturbingly passive. And the plot, Griffith uses that to imply that, and Griffith himself he grew up in the South, and he was by all accounts was kind of had this Southern gentleman quality. So you can tell that some of that is coming through, that women are the weaker sex, and it's the responsibility of men to care for them, because they need that care. And real men worthy of admiration will find the path of Cheng Huan and value the beauty, as it's called. But it leaves aside, like, at what point is Lucy, is she supposed to come into some self-awareness, because in the use of all the dolls in this movie, and I'm not always sure where Griffith was on this, but Lucy's treated like a doll. So she's handed around, and Burroughs, beats the doll up, but to the degree that Lucy seems like a doll, Burroughs and Huan have something in common, even though they're depicted as absolutely opposed. That one is nurturing and caring, the other is brutal and exploitive, but both seem to see her as a doll, either a doll to beat up when you're angry, or as a doll to worship when you're trying to figure out a way to have a life that's worth more than your surroundings. So as we go forward and we look at now Voyager, for instance, the Betty Davis movie, because I'm doing a bit of a time warp with you guys. I wanted to go right to American Beauty, 1990, I think, because it's, in some weird ways, it's almost a remake of Broken Blossoms, even though it's wildly more sophisticated, it would seem. But you once again, you will have a woman who's identifiably in the position of Lucy, where Lester's either going to take advantage of her sexually or come to an understanding of her greater value, and all of the concerns about the numbing effects of secularism, whether it's the brutality of boxing in World War I or commodity culture, getting new couches and the kind of things we see in American Beauty. But very quickly, melodrama became a vehicle, and it was extremely popular with women. I mean, that's part of why it got identified as women's weepies. And see, Hollywood, 1919, Griffith began filming in New York, but then, as you probably know this story, that the weather in New York was terrible. I mean, they needed natural lighting, so they wound up in Hollywood for the light and the lack of rain. That's why they left New York, and that's why Hollywood became Hollywood. It was just some desert town where they just had a lot more light and a lot less rain. So it was very much a technical decision. And they were constantly trying to figure out what would draw people to go see their movies. Genre they stumbled upon genre. Nobody sat down and said, oh, movies are going to be an amazing industry. Let's set up our genres. I mean, and that's what fascinates me, and what I try and get at with both these courses is you have this kind of geological socialism in a weird way. Like these genres are formed by the intense pressure of modern life. And if you think of the way they talk about the earth forming, it was like incredibly hot and there were volcanoes every day. And eventually you got a river, you got a land. And that's how these genres came about, because movies, you have to put all your money up front. I mean, you have to make the movie. And this is still true. And all this press about how did it do the first weekend? How did it do the second weekend? Has it recouped how much it cost to make yet? Has it gone 100 times beyond that? Did it fall way short? You know, is it a flop? Is it a blockbuster? It's you have to put all your money into the movie before you make any money. And that was the biggest problem for producers. Like, how do you get a sure hit? And there's still no clear answer to that, but they stumbled on the fact that genre, predictable genres that audiences had come to show their appreciation for through the box office, would at least guarantee probably a reasonable return. Like maybe it wouldn't be a blockbuster, but people would go see it because they'd seen another melodrama or they'd seen this actor or actress before. So you at least get enough people in the seats to not lose on the movie. And you mentioned, you know, Olivia is trying to figure out, who am I? If it's 1919, I'm watching this movie, who am I? I think that's a great thought exercise. And if you're in New York, you are probably a recent immigrant with children, with a demanding husband. It could be domestic abuse, could be alcoholism, could be adultery, you know, a lot of the just a very hard life. And you've snuck away to a matinee by yourself. And you're sitting there and you're watching the screen and you're looking for some kind of comfort, some kind of reassurance. And that's where melodrama found its formula. You know, Broken Blossoms is a bit severe because everybody's dead at the end, and it's not typical of the 40s. Although it comes back with American Beauty. I don't want to do too many spoilers, but you know, the main characters are, at least one of them dies, the main character. So there's still that, and doesn't mind. We get a voiceover from Beyond the Grave where he says, you know, it's okay, because thank goodness I figured out that I found something. I found a sacredness in life before I was killed. And the fact that there's even a voiceover of somebody who's dead already, you know, obviously there's an afterlife somehow, according to this voiceover. And American Beauty makes very clear something that's implied in Broken Blossoms, which is the point of life in melodrama, at least, is to be able to look back on it and feel like you lived. And the danger is that the secular life has so many imitations of life, to borrow Douglas Sirk's title from one of his other melodramas. There's so many, it gives you fake lives. It encourages fake living so effectively that you can get theoretically to the end of your life only to discover you haven't been living your life. But how do you live your life? And it's very hard in modern life to live your life, because we're inundated with depictions of what our life should be, could be, would be, mustn't be, and you know, and I could go on. So so this fictional woman who has snuck away, who has enormous amounts of work and is looking, you know, it is a little religious. It's I don't think she would have gone in there saying, I'm going to church, but it's remarkably similar. And the movie theaters, certainly the heyday of the 30s, they were cathedrals. They weren't these tin boxes that the cineplexes, eventually became. And I understand as well, there was no television. Obviously, there was no internet. There were no moving images anywhere. So to go and hear live music and see images, and it was 5 cents, but so it was affordable for almost anyone, unlike the theater. And so it would have been an astonishingly, in the capital S sense of this word, sensual experience to hear live music, to hear the organ, to see these images. It would have had the power of a religious service, which is not to say that people felt like they were going there to worship. But in terms of, it was a kind of cathedral to modernity, a place to go that told stories about modernity that were recognizably everyday stories, but did it in such a way that there was the melodrama generated a parallelism where you're watching everyday events in the movie contextualized in a larger transcendent frame. And that's what would have been so comforting to so many different people, because to go back to your fictional self here, Olivia, there would have been recent Italians, recent Greeks, recent some of the Irish, of course. So the early 20th century influxes, there would have been numerous native languages that were different. Everybody would have some grasp of English, and they would that was the common tongue, but they would have been coming from all these other cultures, and wanting to assimilate perhaps to quote unquote America. The melting pot comes to mind too, as that pressure to in the early 20th century to try and leave behind the ethnic past, which would have, in a way, that's where the negative stereotypes get kind of reinforced, is the way to get out from under a negative stereotype of being Asian is to be as little Asian as possible, to assimilate, to not draw attention to it, because what becomes sinister is you're in American culture, but you're somehow still of the culture you came from, and that gets depicted as sinister. Then you're untrustworthy. So yes, thank you for that. So we have to keep our eye on that. And I'm seeing a comment from Teresa. I watched American Beauty many years ago, like when I was a teenager, and didn't quite get the ending of it. After watching Broken Blossom, the concept of melodrama seems to become clearer to me. So Teresa, can I ask you to elaborate that on a little bit? Because that's a great point. You have some sort of retroactive understanding of a movie you saw because you've seen one way earlier. And so can you help me with that? Can you elaborate that at all? If you're out there, Teresa.
Everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Okay, good, because I was having some problem with my mic. So
Yep.
basically, when I watched American Beauty like many years ago, I was pretty much just like drawn to the plot of it. Back then, I didn't really know anything about movies or films, so like it just kind of seemed to be happen so sudden, all of a sudden. Like I didn't want it to give away the ending or like to spoil anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems like it really didn't make any sense to me because it just seems to be happening like out of the blue. Like maybe like now when I think back to it, there might be some like I don't know, like foreshadowing that might be happening like back in the movie. But after watching Broken Blossom, like it just I was having like this epiphany like in the I can't really remember like which part of it, but it's kind of hard to explain because I was also in the same class with Olivia and B70, and then I also watched Written on the Wind. So it was just like after watching this really old silent film, and then it also happens in like the silent film era, that I became more like keen to the idea of melodrama, because I have to say I wasn't a fan of melodrama in the first place, and I didn't really like get a lot of concept of it. But then after watching this one, I seem to be getting like close to the idea of melodrama. Like I'm not really sure how to like put words into it, because it still seems to be a very abstract idea for me right now. But I think I'm getting there.
Yes, good. Well, I think that the problem, of course, is we're talking about feelings, and I'm giving you ideas about how to think about feelings, and but there's that's the very problem melodrama had to deal with, and that people like Griffith found a way to break through to this. Like I can actually use this medium not to promote ideas. It's in that sense, it's not a pedagogical or philosophical genre at all. And in fact, melodrama, fairly enough, is often accused of being over the top. But that's I often what I suggest is that when people say, "Oh, melodrama, it's hard. It's just not very realistic." And I was like, "Well, it's striving for emotional realism, which isn't necessarily going to be very connected to sequential realism." For instance, melodrama, and they borrowed this from Victorian melodrama, but melodrama is always striving for what's called the tableau, the frozen image. So in Victorian melodrama, they would love to bring the emotional pitch to a certain, so that everyone would freeze on stage. And there are moments like this in Broken Blossoms. The moment just before Cheng Huan brings the dagger down. That pausing, because Griffith discovered how much you don't want to be tethered to simply moving the plot along all the time. The Griffith's use of duration is also a breakthrough. Like he holds shots longer than directors were, because they were like, well, they walked in the door, we're done. But the close-up itself is a tableau, and some of these close-ups are 5 seconds or so. That was long. I mean, film was expensive, and it was already 4 or 5 reels to do an hour-and-a-half movie. So the idea of just letting the camera roll, on the face of it, didn't make any sense. Like, to make your shot and be done. The less film you use, the cheaper, and so on. And Griffith took that chance of, I want to keep rolling. I want to, let this build. And he's very effective at coming up with shots that almost look like paintings. I mean, and I noticed when I encouraged you guys to put stills in your prompts, and they're quite beautifully composed. And sometimes you can't fully appreciate that when you're just watching the movie. And particularly when you think of the time, the lighting, the cameras like 400 or 500 pounds. You couldn't move it. You had, even those close-ups were on a dolly, where they had to push the camera along a track, what's still called a tracking shot, but it was literally on tracks. So the amount of labor Griffith put in the search for visual equivalents of emotion, nobody else had thought of that. I think partly because they weren't thinking of it as an art form, and because it was just so much harder to make a Griffith movie and to be in a Griffith movie than other movies at the time. Lillian Gish, of course, becomes Griffith's muse, and it's hard to tell, like, who invented the close-up. Was it Griffith or was it Gish? Because I would argue that it's not enough for a director to say, okay, I'm doing a tight close-up of your face for 5 seconds. That could be a disaster. Gish is I don't even know how she did it. She's not even, I think she might have been 19 in Broken Blossoms, and she would surprise the hell out of him. Apparently, he was terrified of what she chose to do in the closet scene, when she started turning and she ramped it up to a point where Griffith had to stop and say, tell me when you're going to do that. That was terrifying. I mean, he wasn't even directing her. Gish channeled just terror, and she's the one who decided to spin around like a puppet and go back and forth. And the way she uses that space to kind of make us constantly aware that it's tiny by the constant starting and stopping and turning, and also looking up a lot. It's you know, it's like she's praying too. Like, is there something, like, I'm doomed unless there's something else, something other. So I see, and Nina, jump on in. What do you think?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so just to kind of add to what Teresa was saying and about American Beauty, I also have seen that many years ago and sort of vaguely remember being very sort of, I don't know, like put off at the end of it, and just it felt more like a tragedy than anything else. And I mean, I kind of also, I could tying that into Broken Blossoms. I mean, it could very easily also be seen as a tragedy just because there's just so much despair and death and sadness. But then I feel like the difference is that, you know, the melodrama, which I'm like, I was kind of weary of coming into this, but it's more, you know, like death is not the end of it. Like you say, like, so in American Beauty, he has this like this voiceover of like, oh, he's still kind of here and talking to us, but the death isn't the final say of the movie, and isn't the final message that we get. But then also I found that, you know, just following the film, and similar to Broken Blossoms, was that, you know, it was sort of maybe chaotic in terms of like just trying to follow the emotional arc of the movie or of the different characters. And I guess that's intentional. I mean, if that's what melodrama aims to do, is to, you know, show us the emotion and generate emotion, that is naturally not a linear experience for humans. And so then it wouldn't be in the film either. So
right.
Yeah.
Actually, good. That's a lot of good points. So let me start with what you just said, and that is the melodrama is always trying to make the temporal significant by intersecting it with the eternal. So temporal, eternal. So typically, as you were just suggesting with plot and so on, temporal, like this happened and then this happened and then this happened and this happened. When does it get intersected with something from above, if you will, but something that imbues the ordinary moment with the extraordinary. So not only can an object become sacred, but the experience of your life theoretically can become sacred. And certainly the Bible is full of these moments where the most famous is where Saul is on the road to go persecute more Christians, and he gets knocked off his horse by this kind of lightning bolt, and the voice of God says, why are you persecuting me? And Saul converts, that becomes a true believer and stops persecuting and begins to go and became one of the major architects of early Christianity. So there's that idea of, you know, you think you're going along, and you think you know where you're going, and you think you know why, and then you get hit by something. That's basic to melodrama. But what it winds up saying is, where you thought you were going doesn't matter. That what melodrama warns you about is that the danger is not that you're going to die, because everybody dies. The danger is that you're not alive now. And you know, I think of somebody else was just mentioning with American Beauty, but the telling line very early in American Beauty, where he's looking down on himself in the opening voiceover, and he says, in little more than a year, I'll be dead. And it's like, wow, way to give away the plot. What happens when the voiceover is a spoiler? but that's classic melodrama. Like he's like, it doesn't matter what this guy thinks matters. This guy who was me, and he winds up. And then I think one of the most important pure melodramas when he says, "In a way, I'm dead already." And there's a shot of him with his feet just slipping into his slippers. So it's visually, it's a very downtrodden shot, and that's where the ending is confusing. If you don't get that but what's being said here is, I was dead in a much worse way before I died. You know, whether you believe that or not, that is the thrust of melodrama, and that is one of the ways it tries to give traction to where is the eternal in the temporal, where is the sacred in the secular. We need enormous help seeing it. And so often in melodrama, the thing that's sacred, you know, characters strive for this thing they think will complete them. And that striving for that thing is actually blocking them from noticing that the sacred thing is right next to them. And often that's family, of course. And the other warning that melodrama issues is that what you need, you have, unless you are convinced that what you need is elsewhere. In which case, by the time you get to this elsewhere, you'll discover that not only is it not what you wanted, but in the process of acquiring it, you lost what you had. And now you realize they were living next to the sacred this whole time, and you ignored it. And that, like Lucy is kind of a case in point, that she's beautiful and sacred. Obviously her dad doesn't get it. Cheng Huan gets it. And you know, even given the limitations of the stereotypical passive woman, Lucy is allowed to experience herself as an arbiter of value because of the effect she has on Cheng Huan. But that it's that, in a way, I'm dead already. That's a key line, because Burroughs dies never having lived, and because he doesn't learn anything in the movie. He's, you know, the shot we get of him dying is indistinguishable from the shot we get of him fighting in the ring. Like he's has his fists up and he gets knocked out by the bullets, and he dies no further aware of himself or his life than so in that sense, I don't know if tragic's the right word, but he's the classic reason why we want to pay attention to melodrama. That his whole life has simply been one of either getting knocked down or knocking someone down. He doesn't know anything else. Olivia, jump back in. What do you think?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, I thought Nina brought up a great point about the confusing emotional arc of some of these melodramas. But for me personally, I appreciate that. And even just to come back to that idea of whether it's 1919 or modern day, like audience members watching these movies, what it does for us. I get really irritated when things are too perfect. Like if I think about some romances, for example, where it just seems like that's not what real life is like. Whereas this emotional turbulence, to me, maybe this is just my life, I don't know, but to me, that's what life is like. It's this roller coaster of ups and downs. And so when I'm watching a movie where that's being played out, I'm like, yeah, I'm feeling disoriented, but I'm identifying with this in a way that other movies, other genres don't necessarily do that same thing for me. And of course, like other people are free to disagree, but I did think that was a great point Nina brought up.
Yeah, I agree. And you're making me remember that a genre as a way to formulate narrative, genre, and particularly melodrama, can very productively be compared to a roller coaster. Not least of all because roller coasters literally were coming into being in the 1890s. And what a roller coaster does, of course, is it exposes you to something that you can scream and laugh about because you're safe. And that becomes a prototype of genre. And of course, movie reviewers love to say a roller coaster ride. They say it all the time. But there's something more profound there than I think they quite realize. That what cinema discovered is people come into the theater, they sort of strap themselves to the seat, so to speak, and they trust that no matter how many deaths they see, or no matter how horrified they are at Lucy being beaten, I mean, these things are upsetting. They're in a cart somehow. They're being contained by the genre. And so, you know, you go up, you know, that feeling at Canada's Wonderland, and then it's like, and then there's like the little tip, and you're like, why did I get on this thing? At least that's me. But and genre will do that too, you know, the up, and then but you don't crash and burn, you know, then you go into a swooping curve, and finally somehow at the end the roller coaster slows down, and there's the nice guy there to help you out out of the little cart. And it would have been similar no matter what the movie put you through. It ends, and I don't know if you've had that experience of going into a movie when it's still light out and coming out when it's dark, but it's always it's a funny shock, because time stood still in a way. I mean, not literally, you know, you've been there 2 hours, but if you go to a movie at night and you come out at night, it's like, okay, it's 7 and now it's 9. You go in at say 4, or I guess you'd have to go in at 5 and come out at say 7:30, and it's dark. It hits you, your body, like the physical, has been suspended. I mean, not the mentals particularly. You know, you're not surprised it's late, but you're just like, how did this happen? How did it get dark while I was somewhere else? And that's when you often realize that a good, more than most genres, melodrama suspends the time for the audience. To go back to your earlier point, Olivia, it's for a brief moment, the events of your own life are left at the door. And then you resume when oh my God, I got to get dinner on the table, or everything comes back. But for that moment, you gave yourself over to the suspended time as you watch the other people. And the other point I want to draw from what you said is that watching a movie imitates what goes into self-construction. In other words, when you go in a movie and you sit down and it's dark and the movie starts, it starts in the middle of something, like you don't know yet, like, oh, this is a girl walking down a path, and you're trying to put it together, like, why is this girl walking down the path? What am I watching? And the genre helps generate meaning out of experience. And the problem with modernity often is that other than acquisition, it's not easy to have a metric to measure the meaningfulness of your experience. Most of you have heard me go on about grade point averages and these metrics that we have that don't really generate meaning out of experience. They categorize accomplishment. So you can take a class like this and see all these amazing movies, and your GPA is a 3.8 or something. What does that number have to do with anything that happened while you were actually in the class? So modernity has a way of draining experience in order to sort of fossilize it into comparative accomplishment. So that you're 3.8 and they're 3.7. Good. Now we have a metric to say that if there's only one job for 2 people, we'll give it to the 3.8. Because experience isn't marketable in that sense. How do you put a price on it? How do you create a market for feelings? And in a way, that's the niche that cinema found. It's remarkable to me that in an age where emotion is becoming a liability because of the generation of machines, one of those machines, the movie projector, finds a way to generate feelings. So cinema is the machine that can generate emotions, and which is probably why it so quickly became a massive, not just an art form, but a money producer. And you know, I mean, cinema is its own worst enemy sometimes, because once directors and, well, producers more, once they figured out how much money could generate, they you know, they began to, the formulas got tighter and tighter, and we see this today with the six sequels, and they get so repetitive that we start to feel a little ripped off. And then indie movies come along with low budget, and people are thrilled by them because they're not being controlled. They're not having all the rough spots, as you mentioned, Olivia, smoothed out, because producers are terrified about alienating a potential audience member with some difficulty in the movie. But this gets to discuss. Actually, I think you're giving me a chance to maybe do this little 2-minute free write that I've wanted to do, and I don't want to set it up too much, but it's let me just say that what you just said that's important to the free write I'm going to invite you to do is part of what makes things worthwhile is the effort required for them to occur. But we live in a commodity culture, which is designed to set a price point based on convenience. You know, this is faster, this is brighter, this is better, makes your life easier. Well, there's a point where if everything in your life is made easier, your life loses traction, and you can even and that's even often an identifiable plot line in melodrama. I think it's Written in the Wind, the one with the alcoholic rich son, or if I'm thinking, no, that's a different one. Never mind, sorry, that would have been a better example. That was also a Douglas Sirk movie. But notice in Sirk's melodramas and in other melodramas, characters for whom everything is made too easy go off the rails. Alcoholism is often what they turn to. So you have a lot of children of rich parents in melodrama, for instance, who are completely lost because the rich parents, who had to work really hard to get what they have, wanted the experience of smoothing the way for their children. Like, my children aren't going to have to go through what I had to go through. But that's not necessarily a gift entirely to the next generation. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche that the children of wealthy people can lose their way. And sometimes you have to ask, depending on the melodrama, how much of that, of the parent who smooths the way, how much is that about the parent? How much is the parent enjoying what they can do for the child without fully thinking about what's happening for the child? I mean, if as a parent, it gives you satisfaction to remove an obstacle every time your child approaches it, and that's more about you. If you're enjoying your ability to do that, you might not notice that the child is looking for obstacles in a way, or looking for that experience of bumping into something and then figuring out what to do about it themselves, and not having it just removed either before they ever get to it, or the minute they bump it, it's pushed aside. Like, where it gets back to, how can your experiences have meaning if obstacles are removed by others all the time? I mean, and it gets to, like, how do you help? I'll say, I'm old enough to say this, how do you help younger people? Well, not necessarily by removing obstacles. You can encourage them, you can ask what they think they want to do. There's so many things you can do short of saying, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it, that doesn't matter. That's more bewildering and harmful than one might think. So here's my free write. I just want you to take 2 minutes. I'm going to go grab a glass of water while we do this. Write down whatever you want. Just try and keep writing for 2 minutes. And here is the question. What is the difference between sacrifice, you can put that in all caps, and investment. You can put that in all caps. What's the difference between sacrifice and investment? And we're going to take 2 minutes, and I'll be right back. Write down anything you want. You can do it in bullet point or something else. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back, but I need my pens. Hold on. Okay. So sacrifice and investment, and what are we doing on participants? Yeah. So maybe I can. Vic, you mentioned you had A10 with me, so this may be a familiar question in a way. Can you start us off by sharing where you went with the free write, Vic?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, thanks.
Yeah, so where I went with the free write, I just see like sacrifice as you're giving something up and you have no expectations of receiving anything in return. And then when you're investing in something, you're hoping to or expecting to receive more than you give.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent start. And let me ask you, what's in emotional terms, if you can, what's the difference? What's the difference in the feeling when you're investing versus sacrificing? And you just can make up words as you think about it. 'Cause you've made, what's the difference between giving something with no expectation of return and giving something with the hope of return?
I think like when you're sacrificing something in terms of like emotions, I feel like you definitely feel a lot more because it's like, I don't know, you feel like you're giving up everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're investing, I guess like maybe your time or your energy into something or someone, maybe you're like more hopeful that like you'll receive the same energy back.
Yes. Yeah, so I like the point, just even saying like you feel more with this when you with a sacrifice when you give with no expectations. And possibly that's because there's an open-endedness to sacrifice. I mean, if you have no expectations, there's no return, or there's no thought of a return. Something might come of it, but you haven't. It's not like buying a lottery ticket, where you think about, wow, what if I won the $20 million, giant prize, and then typically you don't really expect to. But I think if someone said, by the way, that ticket's not even in the lottery, you'd say, well, what did I just spend $2 for? Even though the chances of your $2 is going to give you 20 million is minuscule, there's just enough of an expectation that it's a very different experience. That even then putting a toonie in the cup of somebody sitting on in Bloor and Young or something like that, there's something about the open-endedness that leaves you with yourself, and it doesn't leave you with an image of your future self. Maybe that's another important distinction. Investments require a concept of the future. The investment's impossible without thinking about the future, and thinking about the future as different than the present. So investment can encourage not being where you are, not living who you are. I'm not that I have a problem with investments per se. I'm just trying to, make the point here that, like so much else in capitalist culture, investments, commodities, they all locate your life elsewhere, as they all formulate your life as not yet. You don't yet have as much money as you could. You don't yet have as much love as you might get. And that chronic not yet, which commodity culture runs on, that chronic discontent, is the other thing melodrama is battling in a way. Can you look around for other metrics to measure value? And because the problem is when you have such a narrow definition of value, you literally can't even have the concept of sacrifice. Because if value is strictly defined as accumulation, and if sacrifice is giving without thinking about receiving, then it can only be seen as losing. You didn't come away with profit. You didn't come away with more than you had when you started. So it's not, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that experiencing sacrifice is almost impossible in the dominant culture without extraordinary effort. Because it always comes back to you as, well, what did you get for what you gave? And nothing, but that's all right. And it's like, no, it's not all right. Why would you give without receiving? And yet it's what we all crave. And to a certain extent, we also crave, because right now we're talking about what it feels like to sacrifice. What does it feel like to realize someone sacrificed for you? Especially if it's a true sacrifice. I don't mean someone who winds up coming back later and said, do you realize what I did for you? Because that's investment. That's always the turning point. A lot of times we think we're sacrificing, but we're not. We're keeping secret books. And so even if you help, let's say you help someone with their tuition or something, and they don't thank you, that you're going to confront whether what you did was a sacrifice or an investment. Because if you're like, well, I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because I thought it would help them, and it seems to have helped them. And they don't seem to have noticed that I helped them, but that's not why I did it. I didn't do it so they would see that I helped them. And there, I think we can see where sacrifice is weirdly comforting, and it's a relief in a way to give without the expectation of return. There's a saying, I forget where it comes from, but expectations are resentments waiting to happen. It's because, expectations are often unstated, and the expectation turns into resentment silently, in a way. because so often we don't make our expectations clear before we do something where we expect a return. The other difference too, I think, is sacrifice is a very different attitude about the future. It's much more eternal. Investment is a temporal. I mean, you literally have interest rates, right? So you invest, MasterCard pays for your $500 purchase, but it's an 18% interest rate. And the longer you don't pay it back, the more interest they get. And so they make money. They didn't do that because they like you. So their attitude toward the future is still accumulation. Sacrifices feels a little more eternal, like I did it because I'm a person and other people are people, and it doesn't have to be transactional. There's another big, sacrifice is not transactional. It's interpersonal. And we're living in a world where almost everything, including what we take to be the interpersonal, is transactional. Those of you remember Hollywood romance, that was a huge problem. How do you know if you're in love? Are you investing in this relationship? Are you sacrificing for this relationship? Is the other person sacrificing? How do you fall in love in modern capitalist culture? And I think, oh, good, we got Mohammed. What do you think? Jump on in.
Yeah, so for sacrifice, I wrote down you don't expect a return from the person you're sacrificing to or for. And the second thing, I wrote for sacrifice, you usually sacrifice to maybe repay someone or something, or you sacrifice your life for your country to join the military or whatever. And I wrote for sacrifice, it's always usually external. You sacrifice to other people or your country or whatever the cause is. While investment is always, I think, is internal. You invest to make more money or make more relationships or expand your circle. And you always expect a return on investment. And yeah, it's usually to benefit yourself more than others.
I think your point about mentioning, your country, let's say, we still hear this phrase fairly enough of someone who dies in battle, paid the ultimate sacrifice. It's one of the rare occasions I even hear the word sacrifice in public discourse. But it's also tricky. This is why are we at war in any given theater is so important, because if you make the ultimate sacrifice so that someone else can make a profit, if it's a war being fought for profit and soldiers are dying and people who aren't in the war are making money, then the soldiers dying are sacrificing clearly. And when I wouldn't want to take that away, but there's something wrong because there's a profit being made elsewhere. So anytime the act of giving gets reconverted into market value, it perverts and distorts sacrifice. And part of what melodrama is trying to do is see if it can reset up an enchanted world where sacrifice can sort of drift up to the eternal. And notice, Griffith's title cards, broken blossom, the light broke in. There's a lot of the title cards that they're a little over the top, right? They're like, oh, flowers, oh, blossoms. And it's like, okay, calm down. I know you're trying to get beyond the secular. Griffith wants holy light to break into these tableaus. Most obviously when Cheng Huan pauses before the knife comes down and everything is glowing in that moment. But I think you wanted to come back with another comment, Mohammed, or did you just have your hand up still?
No, I lowered it. It was up.
Okay. All right. Let's see what I got in the chat. Let's see. Let me back up a little bit. Oh, there's lots of stuff. Hold it. Let me read some of this stuff. Wow, you guys are having class all by yourself. Why am I even here? Okay. sacrifice, you are giving something up with no expectation of receiving anything in return. An investment you are hoping or expecting to receive more than you give. And I think that's the rub. What does that even mean? What is more than you give? That's a really important question to ask, because in melodrama, the implication is if you already think you know what you should get for what you gave, then you've taken it out of the sacred sacrifice register. Melodrama encourages you to quiet down and see if you can hear and feel the effect of your actions in some register that's not market related. And can you get a quiet satisfaction even if nobody else sees it, nobody else acknowledges it, nobody else, but you feel it. Because really we're struggling to feel in modern life in so many ways, to really feel. And often that's a quiet, solitary, sometimes lonely, but extremely fulfilling situation to and there are moments often in melodrama. I won't give away this spoiler, but there's a famous melodrama called Stella Dallas where the mother makes this extraordinary sacrifice for her child, and the film kind of ends depicting this sacrifice, and it's clear that no one's ever going to know that she did this. And the camera is just shining, and she's crying, and just the light on her face is beatific, and it's like, what a gift. What a gift it is to have nobody give you back anything for what you gave, and then you come into a gratitude for having given it. Because that's another word we should bring up here, which is, there's no gratitude in investment. It's like I expected this and I got it back. It's transactional. How can you be grateful for what's done for you? How can you be grateful that you had a chance for what you did with someone else if it gets converted into market value? It just sucks it out. Even sometimes, even in a small way, friends, if you're with friends and you get a couple croissants and one of your friends says, here, let me get this. And you're like, no. And they're like, yes, I want to. I mean, that's this a quiet little moment where we're actually showing that basic need. Like, I'm not going to demand something because I bought you this coffee or this croissant, and that's why I want to do it. I actually want to do it, and you don't have to buy me a coffee next time. Otherwise, or if you think you do, or if that's our deal, then this isn't any fun, because now it's transactional again. We haven't done anything. I bought 2 coffees this time. You buy 2 coffees next time. When do you get to simply be grateful and say, oh, and thank you, and that's enough. That's all that and to know, as again, to be on the receiving end of a small sacrifice like that. It can also be very, it gives you an awareness that maybe you're more than what you know of yourself. Because one of the things that's very hard to know is, what is our value to other people? And it's one thing for people to say it, like, I value you, I love you, and so on. But the most authentic way to convey to someone else their value to you is to sacrifice for them. And that is the most authentic experience that they will have of your regard. And this is something, when you think about gender performance, masculine and feminine, it's so difficult sometimes to know what's being appreciated about you. Is it your performance, like Sybil Vane and Dorian Gray? Is it your performance the other person wants, in which case they need a return on the investment? So in terms of Broken Blossom, on a very basic level, he brings her upstairs, and then he redecorates the room, and he brings out all the silk, and he gives her the doll, and then she says, in admittedly cringy moment. Why are you so good to me, Chinky? Doesn't use his name. And he doesn't, he doesn't really answer, but that's the classic. Well, she's coming into an awareness like, who am I that this happened? I mean, I'm not aware. There's nothing in my life that's made me aware that I could have a value that corresponds to what's being given. And I suppose it's, the experience of sacrificing is important, but equally being sacrificed for is a crucial part of authentic self-worth. And I think, and melodrama demonstrates the constant struggle we have. American Beauty comes to mind again, because the woman that Lester, the young high school girl that Lester Burnham has this lust for, and he partly has this lust because she has a reputation of being very sexually active high school girl. But the reason, I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, and you got to watch the movie again anyway, but her self-worth is so low that she is almost compulsively provocative and encourages rumors and makes up stories about all of her sexual escapades, none of which happened, because the regard that it promotes in other people, she mistakes as a source of self-worth. So this is the crucial moment in the whole movie, when Lester Burnham's, just like Cheng Huan, is poised between finally having what he thinks is this exciting fling with a highly experienced high school girl who's done this with who knows how many guys, and she's fine with it, to this crashing discovery that she's a virgin. And that's the moment where he's going to go one way or the other, because she's like, well, I've never done this before, but I still want to do it. And he's like, oh my God, what am I doing? What are you doing? Who am I? Who are you? You're my daughter's friend. It seems to finally occur to him. And all of a sudden he becomes very tender. It's practically a reshoot of Broken Blossoms, where he covered, her robe, which had been opened, he closes up again. He doesn't suddenly, and just like that, he has no physical desire for her. What he had a physical desire for was his fantasy of who she was. And it seemed like a sort of, like he could indulge his fantasy without hurting her, because that's just what she does anyway. She's just sexually available. So I'm not corrupting her. I'm not doing anything other than what she does all the time. And it's curious that the next, shortly after that, he says to her, "How is my daughter?" Like suddenly seems to come back into an awareness of his role as a father. Let me read a little more though. Let's see. Just okay. At the last year, I watched American Beauty. Yep. Just we're doing a free ride. What's the difference between exactly? Thank you. Okay. Investment has the hidden meaning of being success with more profit, money back. Yet sacrifice asks you to give up some of your belongings, physical, mental, abstract, without having them back. Though in most cases you get some salvation. Yeah, that's another word, because salvation is not profit. Salvation is being saved from something you didn't know you needed to be saved from, like Saul getting knocked off the horse in that story I mentioned earlier. Salvation is realizing that the course you're on is headed in the wrong direction. And it's usually a shocking, in melodrama, but if not possibly in life, it is a little bit shocking to realize that where the course of what you thought was your pursuit of happiness is pulling you further and further away. But we need melodrama because there's very little in modern culture that encourages us to see the value of sacrifice, the value of making the sacrifice, and the value of being the subject of the sacrifice. in the case of women sacrificing their careers for their children, isn't there an intended gain? They would assume that the benefit would be them growing up to be better adults. Well, that's a good point, Sonia. Like, and we see, I mean, look at parental figures are huge in melodrama. Battling Burroughs is a terrible father, obviously. Lucy's mother left. American Beauty's Lester Burnham seems to be ignoring his parental duties. Annette Bening's character as Lester Burnham's wife, she's very much somebody who is tormented by her inability to see anything as other than transactional. I mean, there's a curious moment where Lester's with her and they seem for a moment to be almost recapturing the mood they must have had when they were dating. And then she notices his beer is about to spill a drop on the couch and she just completely freezes and says, this is an Italian couch. It's upholstered in silk. And Lester has a fit and he goes, what is this stuff is nothing. You know, he has this kind of materialistic, and you can tell she looks really sad. And early in the movie, when we see her out there cutting roses and flowers, I might as well call American Beauty broken blossoms. I mean, it's, the rose is just important in that as the flowers in Broken Blossoms. There's so much you can do with a flower. And the first image we get is a close-up of her hand and some shears coming into the screen and cutting off the rose. And on the one, this acquisition of beauty, which kills it. And he's looking out the window and the voiceover says, she didn't always used to be this way. She used to be happy. And then we become aware that she's smiling in the shot, but there's a brittleness. There's a frantic optimism to the Bening character, and everything is in the future. She's going to make more sales. She's going to get this house sold, and not unlike Angela, we see what a trap it is to have a deficit of self-worth that we are trying to augment in all the wrong ways. It's a terrible cycle because the pursuit of what we think will build up our self-worth further demotes it. And that's where problematically the character of Ricky, the drug dealer in American Beauty, is kind of a fascinating. He's the closest thing to Cheng Huan. And there's marijuana instead of opium, but it's similarly situated. These are all things you're going to, I hope you'll get to experience even more when you look at American Beauty again. So the obvious issue of women sacrificing for their children is if they demand a return, then the children can be sort of disabled by whatever support they got. I mean, you can go all the way to Psycho. There's a mother who made an investment in her child and destroyed the child with the ferociousness of her expectation of return. In parenting, the biggest problem of all is you think you're sacrificing, but you expect the child's gratitude to make you happy. If the act of the sacrifice doesn't make you happy, nothing will. Because demanding a return makes it transactional. So even in King Lear, who makes that terrible mistake because he has 3 daughters and 2 of them say you're amazing and the third says, well, I love you, you're my dad. And he's like, that was lame, you're out, and then and the other 2 daughters are horrible to him, and finally he's raging on the heath and he says, oh, sharper than a serpent's tooth, the ingratitude of children. But that's Lear's problem, right? He thought he was being so generous, like, I'm giving you each a third of my kingdom so I can visit you one at a time and just have a grand old time. As soon as he gives away his kingdom, he's this old man they just kick out, except for Cordelia, the one daughter who actually loved him without going on about it, and he disinherited her. So Lear makes that tremendous mistake and pays for it in 5 very long acts for the rest of the tragedy. Let's see, Riley, sacrifice requires a participating party to give in exchange for no personal gain for the good of others. Investment is done with the intent of a return at some point in the future. I invest in a company to make profit. I sacrifice my country's freedom. Investing is done with the head. Sacrifice is done with the heart. That's a nice way to put it, and that takes us back to the earlier idea that you feel more when you sacrifice. And I think you feel more because there's when you sacrifice, the context of that is generated by sacrifice is cosmic, for want of a better word. It's huge. You're suddenly a speck. I mean, on the one hand, it would seem kind of, it's humbling in a way. Investment privileges your ego and the head, and you're making a smart investment, and you're going to get a return. And that's part of the problem, that our expectation becomes a resentment because this ego boost doesn't return. There's something, especially in this sort of self-willed cult of individualism, sacrifice, which is akin to the sublime, to that sense of being actually awed by the fact that there have been, so many generations before you were born. There'll be so many generations after you're born that, to a certain extent, you're not very important. And oddly enough, not feeling very important can help you step outside the market value metric again, because there's something artificial and inflating about how the market makes you feel important anyway. It's not really, doesn't make you feel important, it makes you feel inadequate, and then offers ways to solve that. But it keeps, it's all ego. And there's an enormous, the other thing that sacrifice is not egoistic. It doesn't do anything for the ego. And that's where it can be so important. Because you get to experience the value of being alive for itself. There's a buffering effect in investment that blocks you from experiencing yourself as living. And I think that's the other, crucial difference. So Nina, you connected to Sonia. I thought of that too. Sometimes sacrifice has a deferred expectation of a return. The benefit will come about much later or indirectly. And yes, that makes sense. And I agree. I missed some part of the free ride, but caught up in the chat. I also feel like there's a hidden sense of nobility attached to making a sacrifice. Teresa, help me with that. I think you're saying that in a kind of a positive way. It's how are you using the word nobility there?
I just feel like sometimes when you say or you make a sacrifice, there is some sort of like self feeling as to like, I am making a sacrifice. So like Nina also mentioned, it's about being, altruistic or feeling unselfish. But I also feel like when you say that, oh, I'm making a sacrifice, you do feel that there is a sense of like nobleness attached to it. Like I'm not saying this in like the other way, but
right. Yeah. No, that's why the word caught my attention, because obviously there's issues with the monarchy and so on, but the difference between the monarchy and democracy in this particular instance might actually be instructive, because part of the meaning of nobility is having a connection to God. And the king is presumed to be the anointed by God. And so setting aside all the abuses of monarchies and so on, the way monarchy works is the king is the body, sort of the representative of God, and that can be true of the Pope. And then so democracy will elect a president, but theoretically that they're working for the people. So where the nobility, I think, in a different way to, not the negative sense of nobility, but nobility in its literal meaning as feeling connected to something transcendent, to go back to that word from the prop, because there's no return with sacrifice. The meaning, the only meaning in sacrifice, if it has any meaning at all, is some transcendent term. So one could argue the importance of sacrifice, the importance of giving without expectation of return, is it's the only way to access the transcendent in the secular. Anything, the transactional has nothing to do with the transcendent, because it substitutes transactional for transcendent. And you can't have it both ways. So transactional is a doubling down on the secular without, and the temporal, and a further insulation from any sense of the eternal intersecting the temporal. Because in the moment of sacrifice, the eternal is transecting the temporal, because you're not doing this for return. So it kind of goes up, like the burning of the lamb, right? You have a perfectly good lamb. You could have a perfectly good lamb dinner, and you send it up to the sky as smoke. That would seem crazy, but it sacrifice, like literal sacrifices, the sacrifice of a lamb and so on. It shows how important it is to do something that says, I believe there's more than my everyday life. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have a fully developed faith, but it basically, there's more to life than the effect of the transaction. And whatever that more is, it can be roughly identified as the transcendent. So how do you get a sense of you being connected to more than yourself? You can sometimes, if you round a corner and hike and see a beautiful mountainscape, you may also get that moment of wow, or a sunset on the ocean. It's like, this is so much bigger than me, but I'm here. I'm a part of this. It shows the power of being humbled. Being humbled is the portal to the transcendent. You have to be humbled first before you get an appreciation for being part of something larger than yourself. And patriotism for a good cause would come to mind as well. Yeah, so sacrifice equals surrender. That's also, see, surrender is a term that tends to have a lot of negative connotations in modern culture and in our current culture. But what's positive, if you will, sacrifice, surrender? Why might those be things that we can be grateful for, Nina, since you brought that word up?
I just kind of tied the two together in terms of like, it's a giving up of the trying to have it all together and the self-construction and all of that. I think it's a release of the ego.
Yep.
And so I think the two, as both of them require a giving up, a loss. And
yes.
So, and again, it's definitely seen as not something that is, nobody wants to do that.
So we're told, but no, I think it's a really important point. And like the Annette Bening's character as Lester's wife, where she has something in common with battling Burroughs is they deal with stress by doubling down on control. And the more they double down on control, the less control they're in the larger sense. I mean, there's something pathetic about battling Burroughs being where he has to convert everything into a fight, and he seems to have no other lens for I can't remember Lester Burnham's wife's name right now, so I'll just say Annette Bening. It's painful to watch her. That it's a brilliant scene where she's cleaning that kind of crappy listing that she has, determined, and she kind of defeated from the beginning. It's just a rundown house in not a great neighborhood, and it doesn't matter how much she polishes the mirror. And to watch her belief, that her will, because I think the word will should come up here a bit, because there's something about sacrifice where you surrender your will and trust that that meaning can enter into things you don't control, because controlling is another way to insulate yourself from a sense of connection. You know, when you feel out of control, quote unquote, that's a free fall moment, and then almost anything can happen. You can either double down on control. You can be like battling burrows and lash out at somebody that has nothing to do with it, because I mean, Lucy, by beating up Lucy, he feels like he's taking control of his life. It's on the face of it, it's crazy to beat your daughter, to beat someone who looks to you for love and would be willing to offer it and to hit Lucy in that moment. We see that battling Burroughs is in this, you know, downward spiral. One of the reasons Burroughs likes boxing is that by doubling down on control, you can knock out your opponent. But as some of you pointed out, this is a sports event. It's not actually life. Sports is extremely popular right now, and I have no problem with that. But there's a lot of illusion in sports that that the winning of the event or will somehow establish control once and for all. But I think investment can be a little like that too. I wince when I see the ads for the lottery, because they're so clear that, you know, if you were to win the lottery, everything's solved. First of all, you're not going to really, and they kind of know that, but it's really amazing how many people who win the lottery wind up wrecking their lives. I don't know if you see these stories, and I still don't even totally get it. I'm convinced if someone gave me $50 million, I'd be fine. But I think, but I also, to be honest, I would be panicked because I've seen too many people destroy themselves with money. And my plan for when I win $50 million, I don't know how it's going to happen because I don't buy lottery tickets, is I'm going to immediately buy tons of real estate and then make it affordable housing, and do it really fast before I get destroyed. You know, that would be my almost phobic reaction to someone handing me massive piles of money. It's like, why do you hate me? You know, this is inviting me to do so much transactional stuff that I'll be lost. And you know, I don't want to be poor. Obviously, I don't want to have no income and not be able to buy food for myself or others, but capital, not just money, but capital. This idea that our money needs to make money and that's happiness, that takes us so far away from the experience of gratitude for giving without receiving, and for being on the only authentic experience of self-worth that I know of. Realize that someone just did that because they think you're worth it. They think you're worth it, and they're not demanding the price of that. That's the only way you can really experience that someone did that for me for nothing, because they saw worth in me. And so much of our self-worth is predicated on, we try and promote our self-worth often by attracting people's gazes, if you will, by performing for them. And it's a catch-22, because if they reward our performance, we know it was the performance. This is the plot of Hitchcock's Vertigo, where he's madly in love with her because she pretended to be someone else. Anyway, I'm conscious of the time, so hopefully we open this up. I'm hoping American Beauty will really come alive. I mean, we're literally jumping 70 years. But what I love about genre, Hollywood genre too, and this came up in romance, is there's something about a genre from a melodrama from 1990 and to 1919 that's quote unquote the same, but there's no way it's also the same. It can't, 1990 is not 1919. So when I lectured on The Graduate in romance, for instance, or Pretty Woman, you know, it's so interesting to see, yes, Hollywood romance is still about love, but what that is, or how to locate that, is so different that we seem to be telling a very different story, but the genre is the same. And that's the difference between genre and stories. You can change the story dramatically to try and reconnect to ideals, because culture has a tendency to generate cognitive dissonance. It shatters what we thought we knew, what we thought we understood. And Hollywood genre, at least the best of it, tries to say, okay, so romance is not what it was 50 years ago. That doesn't mean it is gone, but we're gonna have to recalibrate, because it doesn't. You know, the classic example of The Graduate is it foregrounds meaningless sex, because the so-called sexual revolution has simply introduced sexuality as independent of love and commitment. And people were suddenly confused. How do I know I'm in love or not? If you look at the romances from the 30s, the fact that they're in love is almost proven by their willingness to go to bed together. But The Graduate just opens up with, you know, with the kind of very physical sex with zero emotional, and then says, okay, now that that's out of the way, what is love? Because it's not willingness to have sex that prove you're in love on either side. In fact, there's nothing less intimate than a sex that's gymnastics versus some kind of connection. So anyway, any last thoughts? You're always welcome to email me, leonardgary@hotmail.com, with if specific things didn't come up. I have recorded this for obviously more for people who weren't here, but if there's some part of it you want to go over again, you will find it. Otherwise, you should check out American Beauty again for many of you. I will post, well, let's see, what will I post? Oh, I'll tape a lecture on American Beauty. I think Thursday is going to be my taping day, and I'll put up a prompt relative to that before next Monday evening. So I hope this works. This crazy, I can't believe we're still doing this. What's and I know we're running over, but just to ask, is everybody okay out there? There's a loaded question. I mean, is this easier than a year ago last fall, even, or is it depressing, or is it like, okay, I can still do this? Any thoughts about that out there? I'm getting used to it. Yeah,
I feel like I'm used to it now, like just being familiar with the way that everybody posts things and things are recorded. The familiarity helps, but it's still not the greatest.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I feel too. And for me, I'm clinging to basics, because one thing that the University of Toronto is, they don't know what else to do except to try and persuade me to use more of the gadgets on Zoom. And so they offer me tutorials, and can we come and sit in on your class and see what you're not utilizing? And I'm like, no, the hell would I want that? You know, I mean, let me know when I'm doing works and doesn't work, but I'm kind of committed to keeping it really simple, because I feel like this technology is already cool. It's not very warm at all. And they keep getting excited about new ways to do modules and all this stuff. And I was like, no, I'm going to talk to my laptop and look at the chat box. That's all I'm going to do. And I want to know about anything else. And they're like, yeah, but we just, bought this new system. And I was like, that sounds like a you problem. I'm not going to use that because you bought it. And besides, I hope I'm not the only one. I plan to go back to the classroom. I don't know why I need to learn the minutia of these platforms. However, I'm open to you guys. So what's working and what isn't. Mostly the only two tabs I use are announcements and discussion. And so if there's a way I can be more clear, then let's do it. But I like the prompts because that feels kind of personal and it's low key. It's not a lot of pressure on you. It gives me a chance to dialogue with you. But honestly, I'm in a holding pattern. I'm trying to get back to the classroom. So there's only so much I'm willing to give over to perfecting, quote unquote, the social medium. All right. Let me see it because I got a question here somewhere. I was unsure about my thoughts for the discussion problem. I wanted to wait until after this week's live lecture before doing it, which is, yes, is fine. Better understand melodrama. Would it be okay if I handed a discussion prompt? Yeah, tomorrow is fine. And I figure all of you might occasionally not get it in by Monday night. That's another area where I'm trying to keep things alive through this social medium. If I start slapping deadlines and everything, then I have to get all clerical about it. And there's a lot going on with you guys. You've got family, people get sick, you get sick, you worry about getting sick. Right now I'm just not, I don't think deadlines help. So I'm trying to generate a social contract, I guess, of do your best, I'll do my best, and it'll be good enough. And instead of artificial, like, no, it's too late, you didn't hand it in yesterday, so now I won't look at it. But practically speaking, you'll be given a grade on all the prompts. So don't get 5 prompts behind. You'll start to create a problem for yourself. And I tend to respond to the prompts of the week that I'm speaking. So try to do it, but it's perfectly fine. Also, there's no reason you can't go back and add to your prompt if you feel like it, or even say something, I'm hitting reply to other people's prompt. I think you guys can do that too. I think I'm not the only one who can do that. Feel free to do that. The other way I hope that the prompts help is that this is very, like all my classes, this is very cumulative. It's not like when we get to film noir, we're done with melodrama, or when we get to Western, we're done with film noir. They're all mutually constituted. They all keep weaving in and out of each other. And arguably American Beauty more obviously borrows some elements of noir, not least of all the voiceover, even though it clearly comes through as melodrama, but you start to get a bit of hybridity coming into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and we'll kind of talk about that too. So, and did I answer everything else? Yeah. All right. So I think we're good. I'm going to stop.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think professor in this semester will have any in-person components to the course, or it will be fully online?
I'm open to that. I got to see what's going on with U of T, but if there's a given day where I could be out at UTSC, even I just have to look into what that would look like. This class is possible. I don't know how to do it with A10 and A11 because there's no way to do it without putting you guys at risk, because 300, 400 people in a room. But you guys are, 50, or maybe it would be less who would actually want to come to campus. So let me know too, Mohammed. I know you are interested. If there's enough of you guys who want to just make a time to meet in person, and it's doable. I want to say do it outside, but we'll have to do that sooner rather than later, or we'll freeze to death. That would also be a thought, is to have a outdoor gathering. Think about it, and maybe I'll ask you next class when you show up again, and whether there's, because if there's a group that wants to do that, then I think that's probably the way I would do it. I wouldn't make it I wouldn't make it a requirement, because then you get into all kinds of problems. But if there's those who are interested, that would be fun. I'm kind of sick of not doing it. And I know things are, they're definitely safer, but at this stupid Delta variant, it keeps making it difficult to, just how safe is it? Like there are days where I think, oh, it's definitely getting better. And there are days where I think, wow, we're losing control again. It depends on whether I watch the US news or the Ontario news. But what I'm really annoyed about at this point is every time I see what looks like a way out, something trips it up. And I feel this is much more of a film noir than a melodrama at this point. It's just when you think you're home free, some door slams and we're back. And so I've gotten a little, I don't, my emotions aren't going up and down every day on this is, we're heading out or heading, and I'm just getting a little stoic. So, which means that I would be open to something like, I think it'd be relatively safe to meet in a small group, but I want it to be with people who feel like doing it, and not have it be, you know, a course requirement. So I'll think about it some more. And if you guys have any thoughts or tips or encouragements one way or the other, leonardgary@hotmail.com, and we can chat about it there. Okay, I'm gonna sign off. How do I stop? Okay, I'm gonna stop.